Oh, they're my three favorite people. I can see them already. Good evening, everyone. How's everybody today? I'm Joel Kaplan. I'm the Associate Dean at the Newhouse School. I also teach political reporting, and I got my political reporting class here. We can't wait for this to end so they can do some of their own political reporting. But this is going to be the first of basically 4 Zoom sessions coming up to the 2020 election and the aftermath. And we're very excited by that. I'm very excited that we have 3 generations of Newhouse grads who are covering this election. And I'll get to that in a second, but I do want to just mention that it's been a sad week and a half at the Newhouse School. Many of you know, and at Syracuse University. Many of you know that last week we lost 2 freshmen, one in a really unfortunate trolley accident, and the other in his dorm room. And just yesterday we found out that a really beloved Professor Sherry Taylor, who I don't know, Brett or Seema, did you have Sherry? She taught graphics. She was in the Viz department. She taught our military students. She was very active in high school journalism. And she passed away in her sleep 2 days ago. And so we're kind of reeling here. But 2 weeks from today, we have an election. And here's our 3 generation of journalists. We'll go youngest to oldest, okay? We have Brett Samuels, who graduated from the Newhouse School in 2016. He actually went with me to New Hampshire, where he covered Jeb, exclamation mark. Do you still have one of those signs, Brett? You have one of those signs in your home, the Jeb signs? No, you don't? Okay.
No.
Can't hear it. There you go.
No, I did not snag a sign. I have old photos on my phone still, though.
And so
That was both the short peak of Jeb.
The short peak of Jeb. So he did that for the Sarasota paper, and then he worked for another paper in upstate New York, and he's now at the Hill.
Yep.
It covers the White House. The first time I was watching the briefing, and I could recognize him even behind his mask, and he was asking some really good questions. And then we have Seema Maida, who graduated 2000. What year did you go?
98.
98. There you go. This is her 4th campaign she's covered for the Los Angeles Times. So it was 16, 12, and 8. This is your 4th, 2020. And then we have the old man in the group, Michael Kranish, who is an investigative political reporter, spent many, many years at the Boston Globe. He graduated from Newhouse and Maxwell in 1979. He's also a prolific author, primarily on politicians. He wrote a book about John Kerry. He wrote a book about Mitt Romney. And then right after the 2016 election, he wrote Trump Revealed, right? That was the name of it, Trump Revealed.
Actually, during the election.
During the election.
He meant in August 2016, so in time for voters to ruse and help them make up their minds.
That's what we thought we knew there. Everything there was to know about Donald Trump. And you just had a book out on the fastest man on earth, right?
A book called The World's Fastest Man, about the first African-American world sports champion. He was a cyclist, was the world champion in 1899, so long before Jackie Robinson. So it's a story. It's a book about basically racial injustice and how one person overcame this much earlier than people might have realized, and what that tells us today.
So that's great. And so Michael doesn't cover the day-to-day stuff, but he's kind of investigative political, so he's doing a lot of profiling and other stuff. He has covered day-to-day, but we've got the gamut here. And I'm going to, I'll start with Seema, and I'll work my way around. My first question is, what's the most surprising thing you've encountered covering this campaign?
I mean, this campaign has just been so bizarre. It's been a campaign unlike any other, which we knew it would be. I mean, President Trump is a candidate unlike any other. Then we knew going into it that his re-election campaign was going to be very unusual. But then take COVID. we're not covering the campaign like we traditionally would. We're not going to a ton of rallies. Interviewing voters is really hard. We started traveling again a couple months ago, but when you're interviewing a voter with a mask on, 6 feet away, and in some parking lot, like a Piggly Wiggly parking lot in the middle of nowhere, it's a little bit more difficult, and you can't have like the conversations that you could have before. I mean, it's harder to make a connection. It's harder to meet people. It's just people are more apprehensive when you're like, hey, I'm a random stranger and I want to talk to you. So it's been a challenging campaign, and do you see this from the candidates too? I mean, they have responded to it very differently, obviously. But at times they've wondered what to do. Their campaigns have wondered what's the best way to get them out. In terms of the Biden campaign, what is the safest way to get them out? I think that's been less of a concern from the Trump campaign, as we can see. So it's been unlike any campaign I've ever covered.
But you kind of knew that going in, after March, that this was going to be bizarre. But is there anything that's happened that you were just like, oh my God, I can't believe that this happened?
Sure.
I think just because President Trump is a singular candidate, some of this, but this goes back to 2016. Some of the stuff he says, it still shocks me, even though we've had, he's been in the public eye as a politician and then as an elected official for 4 years now, 6 years if you include the campaign. Some of the stuff he says still shocks me because it's just still so unusual, out of the norm of what we are expecting, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. It's just so different.
Yeah. Okay, Brett, to you. What about you?
Well, so I have spent most of my time watching the president and the vice president and their campaign. And I guess what's sort of, especially in the last few weeks, has really stuck with me is almost how it's like watching a different reality almost. The way that they hold these big rallies with hundreds and thousands of people packed in tight, and there's very scattered mask use, to say the least. And like Seema says, a lot of times you see people trying to do interviews in masks, trying to keep their distance. Joe Biden, he has these events where they have these circles set up on the floor to make sure people are properly distanced. And then you watch a Trump rally and it's as if the pandemic, either isn't happening or is a thing of the past. So I think that's sort of been one thing. It's almost hard to be surprised sometimes when you hear the things the president says every day. But I think really just sort of the imagery of these packed rallies has been sort of jarring for me, at least in the last several weeks.
So, Michael, you probably know Donald Trump as well as anyone who's covering him, just in terms of going so deep on the with the biography and all the reporting that was done in 2016. So, and you've seen him in office now for almost 4 years. Anything surprising you?
The surprise is that it's really not surprising. I mean, no one could have predicted the pandemic, so that's its own category. But in our reporting and the biography Trump revealed, which the Washington Post did with a number of reporters, a lot of the characteristics that you see today are very evident in his business life, in his personal life. So I've said for years that I'm really not surprised at a lot of things that have happened. He's bringing basically, that's the person he is. It's just whether people were interested in learning who he really was. He wasn't a reality television star as far as, the character that's presented there. He wasn't a terribly successful business person, but he played one on TV. We wrote that, 4 years ago, and people are still saying like, gee, I didn't realize that he wasn't that successful or he had problems. And, all of that, it may sound like I'm just, touting our book, but we researched very heavily. I interviewed Trump a number of times. Other reporters worked in the book, interviewed him, and he is who he is. This is the man, who a lot of people felt were being stiffed when he was a business developer, and he refused to pay them what he had promised to pay them. He had 6 corporate bankruptcies. He ran his own public company once, and that company's stock went down to become nearly worthless. So if you look at that, you can't be surprised by a lot of things that he's done and the way he talks. He's really exactly the way he talked to folks he was dealing with in business. So none of that surprises me. I guess if something surprises me, it's that he didn't take advantage of some pretty easy things that he could have done to put himself in a better position. And so for, a typical example is he talked about, we'll have a great infrastructure program. Democrats want a great infrastructure program. They would have signed on to, a very large package, and he just didn't pursue that for whatever reason. And there's a number of other things like that he could have done his daughter Ivanka wanted him to stay on the climate change treaty program with the Paris Accords, and he rejected her advice, listened to others, and decided to get out of it. And now he's saying, "Suburban woman, I want you to love me," but they are not so happy with some of the things that he has done. That perhaps, who knows? Maybe if he listened to advisors like Ivanka or other people, maybe he would have been more successful there. So, we've all seen the type of person he is. He wrote in one of his books that narcissism is good, that narcissism helps you become powerful and focused. And there's some people who might agree with that. But he described himself, fairly accurately when he wrote that, I thought. And he cited actually a book by a person, I think the book was called The Power of Narcissism. And I doubt that he actually read that book, but he cited it in an example of talking about why narcissism is good. And now people are saying, gee, he seems like a narcissist. He thought that was a powerful way to operate. Basically, he said, if you recall, during the first campaign, that it's going to take him, that only he could do it, only I can do it, and so forth. That's the kind of person he is. And he still has that self-confidence, even in, the midst of this pandemic, saying, I can fix it, I'm doing it. The scientists don't know better. He said the other day, that if Biden's elected, he'll listen to Anthony Fauci. Well, a lot of people think that, the president should be listening to Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases, basically the nation's best known infectious disease specialist. Instead, he spent the last couple of days calling Fauci, quote, an idiot, just what his advisors really don't want him to be doing. But, Trump is not really one to listen to advisors. He's his own advisor. Well known that he doesn't take a lot of advice from others. He thinks he knows best. And who knows? At this time, on this day, 4 years ago, I can assure you, most people that you were talking to, most of the experts were saying, oh, Hillary's going to win. It's going to be, an historic day and there's no chance Trump can win. And I and others were saying, well, I don't know if Trump's going to win, but he certainly could. And it's way too early. At this point in our nation's history, polling is not as accurate as it used to be. So many people don't have landlines. They rely on cell phones. It's not as accurate. There's a lot of variables you have to build in. And Trump is unlike any other political figure really that we've had in our history. So it's a little hard to project and poll. So here we are 2 weeks out, 2 weeks from tonight. My guess is we'll be sitting here. We won't know exactly what's happened. And I think news organizations rightly, including my own, will be very cautious in making projections because there'll be so many, for example, absentee ballots that will still be out. Could be hundreds of thousands in some states, depending on their rules. So we'd be reluctant to call based on that, even if we know in some instances what counties those come from and how they're probably likely to vote. So I've given you a very long answer, but it is certainly fascinating as a political reporter. I have thought, for many years, for a couple of decades, that the job that I can do best is to try to vet these candidates, tell voters, here's who the person is. Yeah, they have a 10-point plan. They give a good speech or they don't give a good speech, but who are they really? What have they done? How have they been tested by fire? Well, we've seen, this year more than even before, how Trump has been tested by fire, the fire of the virus. That is really probably going to be the decisive issue in this election as voters decide how they believe he's handled that.
So, Michael, thank you, because you're allowing me to segue right into my next question, which is that we literally have 2 weeks of the election, which just seems like we've been running this election for literally 4 years from the moment he was elected originally. The next election began. But as you rightly point out, that your paper, the New York Times and the LA Times and every pundit out there at this time 4 years ago was predicting Hillary Clinton was going to win. I mean, 535 had it like 98%, right? And only
the problem with that prediction, Joel, is that they were talking about, well, if these things are right, then there's 98%. But people looked at that in the New York Times. It wasn't, at that time it was the New York Times. It wasn't 538 or whatever they call it now. It was the New York Times itself. And that person then went on to run this other company. But the problem is that if you looked at the polls the way they were intended to be interpreted and forgot about this, overall the percentages, 90, whatever, if you looked at the polls, they still had, let's say, a 4% margin of error. And a lot of the polls in the key battleground states, in fact, were within that margin of error of 4%. I would urge the reporters who are listening, and thank God that you all are interested in journalism, because we need, great reporters educated at Syracuse for sure. But if you look at the battleground states and the margin of error in those battleground states, you can go back and you can see how in the end Trump was able to pull ahead, in those states. He was behind, significantly, and then in the last couple of weeks, he started to pull ahead. So I would just urge the journalists listening, please don't pay any attention to the national polls. The fact that Biden's up 52, 41, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, because that factors in, California, with all due respect to Seema's newspaper. That factors in, many, states where the vote is not going to make any difference. We know what it's going to be. The number of electoral college votes is going to be the same if the margin's 10 to 1 of those states or 2 to 1. So looking at, that's why we all look at the battleground states. And unfortunately, that particular, and I don't think the Post went as far as the Times did, to be sure. I'm not just being defensive of my own newspaper. But that particular characterization, I think, led a lot of people to think it doesn't matter. It's a shoo-in. There's no way Hillary could lose. It's 90% or whatever it is. And so a lot of people later said, I didn't vote because it was 90% or whatever. And I think there was a misunderstanding, frankly, of, and I would never myself have presented it that way. I am very skeptical of polling, to begin with. I experienced the 2000 race in which, Bush v. Gore and the recount, the Supreme Court decision and so forth. So I just rather, do the reporting, vet the candidates. Yeah, the polling does help us understand the national mood, but it's just more and more difficult to rely on it to understand who's going to win an election, because it can depend on a county in a couple of states, frankly. So the national figures, you have to really take with an enormous shaker of salt.
And I definitely appreciate that, but it seems to me as a quasi-neutral observer these days that the pundits now are bending over backwards the other way, because even the battleground state polls show that it would be very difficult for Biden to lose this. Everyone's saying, oh, but look what happened 4 years ago. And Seema, I'm going to ask you this. It seems also that there just are fewer reporters out there. I mean, 4 years ago there were fewer reporters, but now because of the whole economic dysfunction in the industry, so you end up relying on polls because they're kind of like a cheap and easy way to do things as opposed to reporting on the ground. So how are you and how is the Times doing things differently this year than 2016?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a couple things going on. I totally agree with Michael in that, looking at national polls, I don't know why we do national polls, because that doesn't tell us anything that is actually going to matter on election day. I mean, I think battleground states polls, those are important. They're not predictive. Obviously, there's a moment in time, and especially polling during COVID, we don't know what this means. But it gives us a little snapshot. But I think the most important thing is going out and talking to voters in these states, and we were doing that until COVID hit. And we started doing it again. And there's a number of things that have struck me, but one of the things that struck me the most, in 2016, I wrote a story about Iowa and how it was the state that twice voted for Obama was most likely to flip red because of the number of white voters, the number of voters there who didn't have college degrees, and the number of older voters. I think there's 3 factors. And it was right, but I didn't realize how deep not only would it impact Iowa, that it would impact other states in the same way. So I think, the thing that I've found this time around that's been really interesting to me, which in 2016, I knew that there was a segment of the population that really disliked Hillary Clinton. I did not realize how deep that dislike was. And that's the thing that has come up over and over and again when I talk to voters in Michigan and Ohio, just all over the place, Iowa, that in Pennsylvania, the idea that I've met so many voters who are like, I just couldn't vote for Hillary. I didn't vote for Trump. I sat it out because I was like, the lesser of two evils. But they don't hate Joe Biden, and they don't have the same antipathy towards Joe Biden that they did towards Hillary Clinton. And so I wonder how much that factor is going to make a difference in this election. And these are different things that I think if we didn't have COVID, if we were on the ground, if we didn't have to stop traveling for a period of time, like if we were still flooding the zone in a way that we just haven't been, those are threads I really would have liked to explore more. But COVID just really changed our ability to report on this election. And talking to pundits is great. Talking to professors is great. No offense, Professor Kaplan. But talking to real people in these places who are not reading the New York Times, who do not live, who are not junkies who read 538. That's so important. And we've done some of it, but I really wish we could have done more. But we simply couldn't because of pandemic.
So what's interesting is my political reporting class, is actually working with the Lehigh Valley Times, looking at this one county in Pennsylvania that went for Obama and then went for Trump. And they just did a survey. And the interesting thing, Brett, is that it showed that it's not so much that people are voting for Biden. It's all about they either want to vote for Trump or they want to vote against Trump.
Right.
That's what the whole campaign's about. Brett, are you seeing that, or is that wrong?
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I mean, that's the president, essentially what his campaign will argue is that enthusiasm for him is so much greater than enthusiasm for Joe Biden. But what they have to overcome is that enthusiasm against the president is just at, such high levels that people are turning out in droves. I mean, I think Professor Kaplan, you said this at the start. It's a lot of people have been waiting 4 years essentially for this election to come around for a chance to vote the president out of office. So, President Trump spends a lot of time, most of his time really just kind of appealing to his base of supporters. And so he's essentially betting, that if he can drive up turnout among just his supporters and his core base, he's essentially banking on the idea that that will be enough because people aren't enthusiastic enough about Joe Biden to turn out for them. But yeah, certainly he's sort of up against this idea of, like Seema said, there are people who sat out the election 4 years ago. Now they've gotten a chance to see what President Trump is like in office. They were not fond of it, and now they're going to go vote for Joe Biden. So yeah, that's one of the biggest factors going against him right now is sort of the anti-Trump sentiment that a lot of people are feeling after 4 years.
If I could just piggyback onto that, I was just in Arizona to do an early voting story. And I mean, we know early voting across the country, we've never seen anything like this in our lives. I think when I looked on Saturday, the last figures were like 26 million Americans had either mailed in their ballots already or had gone in person to early voting sites. I mean, these numbers compared to 4 years ago are just exponentially larger. So when I went to Arizona, it was like the third day of early voting, and this is anecdotal, obviously, but every single person I talked to like dozens of people, every single person I talked to who was voting for Biden, not one of them brought up any of Biden's policies or like, I love Joe Biden because X, Y, Z. They all said because we had to get rid of Trump. I mean, it was universal. And then the Trump supporters, I mean, they were very enthusiastic about him, and they were not enthusiastic about the Democrats. But I think what Brett said is absolutely right. So like this campaign it seems entirely driven by, you either love Trump or you hate him. You don't hear anybody talking about Biden's, home health care plan, family leave policy or anything else. And, in most campaigns, you don't hear people talking about policy. But in this campaign in particular, it is just singularly, it seems, about Trump.
It's interesting because when you always talk about races, you always talk about the generic Democrat or the generic Republican. Joe Biden is the generic Democrat.
Right.
I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. So. Well, I want to open it up to questions either live in the audience or over Zoom. What do you got? Brandon, go.
Oh, you meant Evan. Cool.
Oh, Evan, sorry.
Yeah.
I can't see you. Sorry.
I was just wondering, you were talking about how on election night, with all these mail-in ballots, we're not going to know right away. And I was wondering what you guys expect the atmosphere to be like in your newsroom with all this uncertainty we're expecting.
So that's a great question, and I know that you were there, Michael, in 2000, but that still took everyone by surprise. How are you preparing in all three of your newsrooms for this very uncertain election night when you have the president basically saying, if we don't know by election night, there's fraud, and you have everyone having the expectation that when they go to bed, they should know who wins?
But I think the media has
3 hours, Seema, so you should have the.
You have an advantage. It's true, but I mean, it's like you look back to the Iowa caucuses. There were the caucuses, which I love the caucuses. I am totally biased there, but the Iowa caucuses were a disaster in part because the media has set this expectation that 10 o'clock we're going to know the winner, and then we'll wake up tomorrow morning, we'll go to New Hampshire, and we'll do it all again. And I think that we're to blame for this in part because it's better to do it right and take the time as opposed to getting it first, which is true in so many cases in journalism and in life. So it's in California, this also isn't entirely surprising because we have a lot of mail-in ballots, and it always takes, and I think we're a little bit slow in counting our ballots. So for example, when Kamala Harris ran for AG in 2010, we didn't know the results so close to Thanksgiving. But that was a very close race. So I think, I'm glad that people are talking about the idea that if we don't know on election night, that's not because something necessarily went wrong. It's because people are taking their time and are trying to, do it right. I hope that message is getting through to the public. And you see some secretaries of states across the country who are talking about that, both Republican and Democrat, which is, I think it's good to have people on both sides of the aisle saying, just because this might take a while does not mean that it's rigged, that this is just democracy in action. The other thing is if we're talking about a situation where it's fairly close, but if early on, there are some states that are better at counting ballots than others. I'm from Pennsylvania. We're not particularly good at doing things in a timely manner. It takes us a while, although this recent Supreme Court decision is a little bit helpful. But Florida, despite 2000 being a debacle in Florida, I think they're allowed to start counting their mail-in ballots earlier, and it's expected that I think if we know Florida and it's a substantial gap in Florida, that's going to tell us a lot about what the rest of the night, how the rest of the night is going to go. So, I think while it's really good to prepare, on the idea that we're not going to know, I think there also is a chance that we will know a lot that night.
So, by the way, who did win the Iowa caucuses?
It depends who you ask. Pete Buttigieg tied with, I want to say Bernie, but I could be making that up.
Michael, so the Washington Post is really one of the most successful news organizations in the country in the last decade or so, thanks in part to Jeff Bezos putting a lot of money in there. I assume that it's going to be all hands on deck election night, but what does that look like?
That's what it looks like. We have, reporters who are going to be assigned to watch voting situations in every state that could be key. There'll be all the usual political reporting, but a large part of the newsroom will be focused on what's going on in certain states. I've, volunteered to, if there's some problem in a particular state, I'll hop on a plane and go there, so we can extensively report that. I've seen this, not this movie before, but similar ones. In 2000, I can so vividly remember being in the newsroom of the Boston Globe up in Boston, and it was back and forth, and my job was to write the main story. Who won the election, Bush or Gore, and the editors were like, we need to call this soon, and the print edition's going out the door. And to reference Seema's comments, my dad was a wire service reporter early in his career, and his news service had a hat that said, "Get it first, but first get it right." And my dad, who went to Syracuse, a graduate of the Syracuse journalism program, pounded that into my head. there are just several things that he told me, that stick with me, to this day. And so whenever I feel certain, pressure on a story, I always have to remember, what he told me, because if I don't follow that advice, it'll come back. And so election night in 2000, someone saw what was predicted on CBS News, went with that, and basically put out a version of the story that hadn't been fully vetted and approved. And I remember running over to someone, and for the only time in my career, literally saying, "Stop the presses," because we don't know yet. AP hasn't called that. This is somebody on CBS. And they did, stop the presses, but they'd actually already printed a certain number of copies, a small number. But, I don't have the authority to do all that. But to me, that lesson is just there. So I certainly remember in 2016 where people were saying, it's all Hillary. No, we don't know. Let's just see what the numbers say this year more than ever, because the concern. Trump has certainly fed this idea that there's fraud and the mail-in ballots are going to be meaningless, or they're going to be dumped in the river or something. So a lot of people have uncertainty. I was talking today to an official in Ohio who said that in Ohio they have, instead of running everything from the top down for the Secretary of State's office, there's 88 county boards of elections, and they all run them bottom up. So, how are they going to get everything, known concretely at the last, right on deadline? I don't know that they are. And they're going to have a lot of absentee ballots to count, well after Election Day. So multiply that times a lot of other states. And I just think we have to be really cautious. And if someone else, this is me speaking, I'm not speaking for the Post, I'm just saying my own view. If someone came to me and said, "What do you think?" I would say, if we get beat, I'd rather get beat on that story. I want to be right 100%. This is not the kind of story, that's so competitive that getting ahead by an hour or a day, in the end, people want to know what's right. And our currency is our credibility. And so we want to be, very careful. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people anxious to call it, for their person. There's a lot of speculation that Trump is not going to concede unless it's, overwhelming in some way. And that's caused a lot of concern about what that means for our democratic system, because it's based on the idea, like Al Gore getting up and saying, it's in the best, service of our democracy that he concede. So, I do wonder what'll happen. It could be smooth, or it could be a crisis point yet again, for our country.
I think we just need to be really transparent about it also. Like before, I feel like when I was younger, reading the paper, even when I first started my career, when newspapers make calls and stories, it's sort of like the voice of God has said this person is one. And we didn't understand what we were basing it on or who, and particularly now we wait for AP to make calls. But I think, this election night in particular, we need to be really, transparent about, here's what we know. Some people might be saying X, but here's why we're not calling the race, because these, there's the X, if we can say there's X number of ballots uncounted in these critical states. And I think the more we can tell readers about why we decided to make a decision not to call it, in particular, if we don't call it, the better. Like, I just think that would be really helpful instead of just having, I think we have a habit of sometimes keeping all that sausage making behind the scenes. But I think in this case, it might be helpful to really let readers know how we're making these decisions.
Well, in the past, the networks have kind of led the way, and they based much of what they did on exit polling. But it seems to me that this year exit polling is worthless because there's so many mail-in or voting in advance. So what good is exit polling?
Right, and people also aren't spending as much money on exit polling and polling. I mean, yes, some people are still spending a lot of money on polling, but a lot of people have cut back because it's, doing good polling is really expensive, and doing good exit polling is really expensive.
So Brett, I don't mean to leave you out. What's the plan at your shop for election night?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Seema and Michael have already said, that I think transparency is going to be really important. And I think it's important to let people know there's kind of a lot of moving parts, especially this year, with all the mail ballots being used and early voting. And I think it's important to try and educate the public on, some states are able to start counting their ballots before others, and other states have to wait until election day to actually, open up those mail ballots and start counting. And some states have, changed their policies and during this election season. So I think, being transparent and providing that info so that readers, are aware, oh, well, here's why Michigan's results are in, but Pennsylvania's are not, for example. I think that's really important just because this is sort of an unprecedented election season in a lot of ways. And then I think the other thing is, which Michael sort of alluded to, the president himself is kind of a wild card just because, I think there's an inclination that when the president says something or when the president tweets something, it's sort of taken as news. And so I know at least for us, we're still trying to figure out and game plan for how we will handle it if, the president is to tweet on election night, he declares he's won a state, for example, when it's too early to say. So I think, there's a lot of sort of factors that are still being worked out, but it's definitely, there's a lot more to game plan for than a typical election season, I would say.
Great, thanks. So Amanda, you have a question for me here?
Yep, we've got a question coming in from a virtual viewer, Megan. Megan, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, I am an M&O grad from 2013, and I had a question for you guys, sort of to Brett's last point about misinformation. So obviously we had the Hunter Biden story in the New York Post last week that most major news organizations chose sort of to not cover in a significant way, and which has a lot of hallmarks of modern disinformation campaigns, as well as the proliferation of QAnon, right-wing militia groups, and obviously the misinformation spread by the president himself. But I'm curious how all of you are thinking about covering these stories, particularly when it comes to choosing which ones to cover and framing and just how you are handling just all of the bad information out there in such a crowded information environment.
That's a great question, one that I wanted to ask myself. So who wants to volunteer first?
I can go ahead. I mean, we do our own reporting. In some cases, and I think there was a short story about that because it got so much notice. Some people might be wondering what's actually going on here. So I didn't write that, but I think there was a story that made it clear that this has not been verified. But we do our own reporting. We don't need to go and just simply always say we'll give credit. If we believe this is a legitimate story and New York Times reported such and such. I've done stories numerous times, and I go out of my way to give someone credit if we feel they've revealed something that, we need to credit to them. But we don't, at the same time, we don't feel we just need to simply say such and such organization reported this. We don't feel the need to say President Trump said, something. It's newsworthy to look at what Trump tweets, but that doesn't mean you simply say, Trump tweeted yesterday X and leave it at that. We have an extraordinary fact-checking operation at the Washington Post. They actually published a book this year about all of the misleading statements that Trump has made. So it's quite detailed. And I think, in today's age, that's extremely important. And I'll tell an anecdote about Syracuse. My first attendance at Syracuse actually goes even further back than you might think. I was a 16-year-old high school student, and I was able to get into a program for high school students at Syracuse at the Newhouse School. So I took a course, 2 courses in journalism at the Newhouse School way back in 1974. And one of the texts in that class was All the President's Men. And on the last day of class, as I left Syracuse, Nixon resigned. So you couldn't have planned the semester, chronologically, narrative, drama-wise, any better than that. And, so things seemed at a crisis point at that time. But I think the next day we had confidence, like, the system works. This is incredible that this happened, that Nixon wasn't, resigned from office. But the next day it's like, well, this is America, it's democracy. Somehow we're all going to go on. There's certainly some more uncertainty here because of the extraordinary number of, false statements. And we have to be honest about it. We're not being opinionated in saying that. I can remember back at a Syracuse class, a great professor, accurately said at the time that, a lot of people's concerns were that the media is some kind of gatekeeper, that the public doesn't have access to information other than what the media provides it. And if that's the time, before the internet, before cable TV, you had just a few networks, you had major newspapers. And the point is that a lot of people at that point thought, how can we depend on this very small, quote unquote, elite group of providers and gatekeepers for the information? And now it's the complete opposite. There is this flood of information. And how is the public to figure out what's real, what's not, what's disinformation, what's misinformation? And so we try very hard to do fact checking and to try to understand, what's real. And you'll see in countless stories at the Post, for example, where, the president yesterday said, without verification, or he said it falsely, or whatever, the story said, it's really quite a growth. And I think it took a certain amount of time for people to feel comfortable doing that. But there's a realization like this is unprecedented. We really need to, inform readers. And then there are, of course, plenty of people who are going to look at that and they may think, well, that's just, you're taking a political edge. But I can assure you the vetting that goes on for any single story is extraordinary. When we wrote the Trump Revealed book, it's read by numerous editors. It's read probably by 3 different lawyers. It's read, by us again to make sure is every sentence essentially verifiable. It had hundreds and hundreds of footnotes, for example. So a lot of the public, we get bashed as fake news or whatever. But a lot of the public may just assume that that's the case. They hear what Trump says. He says we're the enemy of the people, quote unquote. That the press is the foundation in a lot of ways of our democracy, the distribution of ideas and being able to state that. But, not all of the falsehoods. In other words, part of our job is to make sure that we accurately, report what's out there. And that can be challenging. And if we're not sure of something, we can wait. Someone might beat us on a story like we talked about earlier. I'd rather be beaten, than risk being wrong. We really do want to get it right, because otherwise, accurate, fairly, people will hold us accountable, for that. So my mantra often when I've worked on projects or worked on the books is that, we want this to be tough but fair and to make it bulletproof. Someone, says, how'd you come to that? We can drill down and we can show you exactly where this is from. Not a secondary source like, well, so-and-so wrote it in a book, but like, where did the actual information come from? And when you have that discipline, hopefully it makes you healthy paranoia when you write, that whatever you write, you go over it carefully. And so, for the younger journalists who are listening, or the aspiring journalists who are listening, I would certainly urge you to stick to that. You can't check carefully enough, because sometimes the simplest things, they're based on an assumption, and you can get tripped up by that. So, you just need to double check and go back and make sure. And then once it's out there, you're going to stand by it. Your editors are going to stand by you, and you'll be glad that you took every extra step you could to try to verify what you're writing.
Oh, if I could add that. So earlier today, we had a debate planning call, and this is exactly one of the things we were talking about. We were planning for the debate on Thursday, and the president, or fairly certain that the president will bring up the Hunter Biden story, the New York Post story. We've largely not reported on that story because it's so unverified and it's flawed, and in so many ways. And it's a question of do you want to give something more? And this goes for other conspiracy theories. Do you want to give it more exposure, more air? If you report on a certain aspect of it, and it's something you have to balance. And so we've come up with sort of a plan for the debate night coverage, which is having this. When debates are crazy and they're moving fast and you don't want to make a mistake, and just having language ready to go that really explains sort of the flaws in this story, because if the president brings it up, which we all suspect he's going to do. And then more broadly, I think with QAnon and all of these things, I mean, we've written about QAnon, we've written about candidates who support these crazy ass theories, pardon my language. But we've done it from we've been opinionated in a way that we're normally not opinionated, because if somebody is talking about people killing babies to drink their blood to stay young, I mean, I think at that point you can say that's crazy. Political differences, which infrastructure project policy is better, that is different, that is subjective. But if I think we've come to this point where there's a certain level of thing where if it is so far out of bounds, we can call it what it is. And I think that's grown, in the past 4 years. In 2016, during the campaign, I think people were really reluctant, to call out, when the president said things, when then candidates said things that were quite obviously untrue. And I think our broadcast colleagues in particular, the president would have the candidate then would have a rally for an hour and a half, and it would play unfiltered, unfact checked all the way through. It was a huge advertisement. And I think we all look back at our coverage of, Donald Trump as a candidate, and I think we all learned a lot from that. And I think that's really influenced the way that, we've covered his administration and we've covered his second campaign. And I think that's why you see a lot more fact checking. You see a lot more real time saying, okay, this is true, this is not true, this is why that's not true. And I think it was a real learning experience. And every candidate in every campaign tries to shape the truth to go in their direction. But you always have to call that out. But this past 4 years has been, or this past 5.5 years, I guess, has been just, it's highlighted the need for that more than ever before.
So I want to thank Michael. I know he's got more reporting to do, and he came agreeing to stay for half an hour, and we kept him for a little.
It's okay. Go ahead.
No, I'm just thanking you and saying that Seema and Brett will continue on, but I know that you have to go. So thank you.
All right. This was great. Thanks so much, folks.
All right, Michael. Right. So I want to go back a little bit to the Hunter Biden thing, because I have been looking at a lot of the right-wing blogs and some of the right-wing news organizations, including, obviously the New York Post, and the Times had a good piece about what was going on internally. But if you read some of the right-wing blogs, they are absolutely convinced that, and it's kind of like the opposite of the George W. Bush National Guard thing, right? Where they're the ones who discovered that it was fake. Here, they have step-by-step to prove that this is actually a real story, and that the mainstream media, which both of you represent, are just covering it up by not covering it.
I mean, I would say look at Fox News. Fox News turned that story down because they couldn't verify it. Yes, you have Tucker Carlson on his show talking about it, but the journalism, the news side of Fox News turned that down. So, okay, if you want to say that, my paper is biased or whatever, or MSNBC is biased, fine. But I think that's a data point that you can look at, that, the most conservative, broadcast station that, has, been very helpful to Trump's campaign and to Trump's presidency, said that they couldn't touch it.
Yeah. Brett, he'll touch this at all? And I mean, I don't know how you avoid it when the president's going, as Seema said, on Thursday night, the president guaranteed is going to be bringing this up.
Right. So how we ended up writing it is we did end up writing something, I think maybe the day after it was published in the New York Post. But we didn't, the way we framed it was not, here's the allegations against Hunter Biden. I ended up writing that story for us. And what I tried to do is essentially lay out, okay, here is the story from the New York Post. Here is the sourcing that they have for it and sort of the questions around it. You try to point out, okay, Rudy Giuliani was a link from the hard drive to the New York Post, and Rudy Giuliani was in contact with this Ukrainian guy who was later charged as being a Russian agent. It was this hard drive that was left for 9 months, but the guy was unclear if it was actually Hunter Biden who dropped it off. And I tried to obviously include what the Biden campaign is saying, that they denied that this meeting ever took place. but it's the type of story that, at least for us, we found it was worth writing about, just because of how significant the president and his allies were playing it up. But certainly, there's a way to do that, I think, where you include the right context, where you try to show people, okay, here are sort of the flaws in it and the holes in it, and here is why, there's reason to be skeptical about it. But certainly, yeah, I mean, this is essentially has turned into the president's closing message on the campaign trail. So it's really something that's hard to ignore entirely. You just have to kind of go about it in the right way and make sure that you're including the right context and letting people know what they need to know about sort of the question marks about it.
But then you also have the Director of National Intelligence, who evidently oversees all intelligence coming into this country, who basically gets up there and swears that this is not a Russian counterintelligence operation. So, I mean, it's no longer just on the fringe. The President of the United States is going to bring it up. And the Director of National Intelligence, although chose his words carefully, basically said that there's no indication that this is something like a Russian intelligence operation.
Yeah, no, it's it's not something that's going away anytime soon, certainly. And it's in a way, it's like impeachment part two. There's a lot of sort of similarities in both the fact that Ukraine is involved and Hunter Biden is involved, and now the president is calling for an investigation into the Bidens. But yeah, I mean, I think you just have to kind of make sure that, I forget if Seema or Michael said this, but essentially, if just because somebody in a position of power says something, there's a way to go about reporting it that's not just, putting in the headline, Director of National Intelligence says, quote, but yeah, no, certainly it's a complicated story, and it's made even more complicated by the fact that the way it came about is so suspicious or sketchy or whatever you want to say, that just kind of, I think, further complicates how you should report on it.
Patrick has a question for you.
Yeah, so if you're going to cover a story like that, where basically your entire coverage is just saying, look, this is out there, we don't think, there's nothing that can validate it or prove that it's true, how do you go about organizing an interview with someone if if you don't really believe the things that they're saying?
So basically, how do you cover this type of story? Because it's out there and it's kind of making waves, but who do you interview, and do you even, you could spend time trying to verify it or debunk it. So I guess the question is, given that it's got this massive thing going on there, obviously you're not going to spend time trying to verify or debunk whether some people are pedophiles who drink blood, right? The QAnon stuff. But this has gotten some traction. And, the New York Post did run it on the front page. So do you take the time, or not necessarily you, but somebody in your news organization take the time to say, okay, fine, we're just going to go and we're going to verify it or debunk it?
Thankfully, this decision is made by people far higher than me on the pay grade, because it's a really complicated, hard decision. We have a limited staff. We have a few more people since we've been hired by Billionaire recently, but still, our staff is nothing compared to what it was 10 years ago. And we're trying to cover this campaign that's crazy and, that's just so different and it needs everybody we have. And, our White House team, I think, has done a really great job of balancing it. But if we wanted, we could throw our whole DC bureau on this, and would that be the best use of their time? I don't think it would be. I think it's more important. Obviously we need to do some basics on this, but I don't think this story, and this is just my opinion, but I don't think this story deserves, from what we know about it and what we know about its sources and what we don't know about it, I don't think it would deserve a full-on, team crush follow kind of thing.
Yeah. So Brent, it kind of ended up in your lap. You drew the short straw, obviously. So did you think about doing a deep dive and, trying to talk to everyone whose quote unquote emails came out of this web stuff?
Yeah. So, what I ended up trying to do is basically talk to the main stakeholders who are sort of impacted by the story, which included the Biden campaign, the Trump campaign. I unsuccessfully tried to track down Rudy Giuliani. But he, I think to Seema's point, it's the final 2 weeks of a presidential campaign. People are kind of trying to decide what is worth the resources, worth the time. And so, I try to do my due diligence and talk to the people who clearly have a vested interest in whether this story, is portrayed as, completely accurate or the details of the story. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough decision, and certainly as more information comes out about it, I think that sort of you might change trajectory to spend more time on it. But, when it came out, there were just so many questions about it. I think it was not something that most major newsrooms dedicated a huge amount of time and resources to.
Yeah, I actually thought the New York Times took an interesting angle by looking at who actually had bylines around the story and finding out that one of the two people, one had just come from Fox News, and the other one didn't even know her byline was going to be on the story. So, and the one person who wrote it asked for the byline taken off. So that's always an indication. But, as political reporters, we're now in the expectation of October surprise, right? You had, the hostages during Jimmy Carter's day, and you had the George W. Bush DUI that happened the weekend before the election. Most people think the October surprise actually happened October 1st when Trump got COVID. Do you seem to think there are any other October surprises in these last 2 weeks? And do they even matter with probably a third of the people who have already voted?
I mean, with 2020 and everything that's happened this year, we could have a meteor, we could have locusts. I mean, I'm not counting anything out because what a year. I mean, there's so much has happened. But also, I think to your point, I don't know that it matters anymore. But first of all, most people, yes, there are still undecided voters out there, but most people are really dug in their positions. And then we talked about earlier, how many, 20 some, as of Sunday, I think it was 26 million, and I know the number's gone up since then, and 26 million Americans had already voted. So I think, and also for future campaigns, when we talk about an October surprise, maybe it's a September surprise now, or, maybe it's an August surprise because people are voting so much earlier. It's not election day, it's election month.
Yeah. Brett?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm trying to remember, there was a 1 week stretch where it was the debate happened, and then that audio came out of Melania Trump from her former associate about her bad mouthing Christmas. And then the next day, the president tested positive for COVID. And then the next day he was in the hospital. So it just seems like one thing after another. And now, of course, the Trump campaign would argue that this Hunter Biden stuff is their October surprise. And it would seem that they're kind of expecting a drip of that stuff almost up to the election. So the question is, to Seema's point, how much, first of all, when there's just such a wave of and a crush of news all the time, how much are people just fatigued essentially and unable to focus on one particular scandal? And does that scandal get washed away within 24 hours? And then to our other point, people have been voting for several weeks now, and people are just kind of so dug in on their positions about this president, especially that, I'd be curious to see, what magnitude of an October surprise it would take to really persuade a significant percentage of voters at this point.
But remember, 4 years ago, the Access Hollywood tapes came out shortly before Election Day, and everybody, I'm not just talking about the media or Democrats, Republicans, the president's campaign, many members of the president's campaign thought it was all over. There was, talk in the RNC about, can we still remove him from the ballot? People thought that would blow up, and nothing, it ends up being meaningless.
Yeah, to that point, it's this year, I think it was October 7th maybe was when the Access Hollywood tape came out. And this campaign cycle, when you would talk to people that first week of October when the president tested positive, people who you would ask oh, is he done? What are his chances now? They would always point to say, well, the Access Hollywood tape came out on October 7th. So, things have happened later that have shifted the trajectory. So just sort of an interesting marker of time, I guess.
I think time for one more question. Anyone? There we go. Jordan.
So when you have a weekend, a series of events like you were talking about, Brett, where the tape comes out to Melania and then the president gets COVID and a whole bunch of other things that are happening that particular weekend, how do you cover all of those events without spreading yourself too thin?
I cover all these events at one time, and they're not even 24-hour cycles; they're 3-hour cycles. So basically, what Jordan's saying is that you got 6 stories in a 24-hour period of time. How do you do that?
I rely on my editors to prioritize it because we don't have the bodies to do that. So some things where we're not going to add any new context. We would just be using staff time to report something else that people have already reported. We use Wire on that because we're trying to save our staff time to things that we are doing that are unique and meaningful, for our readers. If it's an enormous story, like Access Hollywood was, 4 years ago, then of course we jump, we throw reporters at it. Like I was in Wisconsin that weekend when it broke. It was crazy. So it very much varies. But I think the idea, I think back in the day, like we used to take pride in not ever running a Wire story about this, having a staff byline story on or anytime anything like this happened. And I think we really moved away from that. I think it's wise because, for a basic story that, requires a couple hours of time, a couple phone calls, a little bit of writing time, where we are not adding a single new drip of information. What is the value of us using our time on that when we're limited in the number of bodies we have and the number of hours we have in the day?
Yeah, I think whoever asked the question talked about trying not to spread yourself too thin. It's like a tough task actually these days, just because it's like a 24-hour news cycle. I remember, we ended up covering that Hope Hicks tested positive at like 7:00 at night. And then the president went on Sean Hannity at 9:00 to talk about, I was just tested. And then it was like 1 a.m. that he tweeted, being the first lady and I have tested positive. And then, the next day he's in the hospital. And then that night his campaign manager tests positive. And it's just, it really can just be kind of an endless wave of breaking news. So, definitely covering the day-to-day can just be sort of like a nonstop barrage of headlines and different storylines and everything to cover. And I think to Seema's point, it can be helpful to sort of take a step back and say, okay, which of these things are worth the time to blow out a bit and focus a bit more on the big picture, or try to move forward or write a story moving forward on them. And it can be tough. It's just this president, he likes to talk pretty much every day to the press or to his supporters. So it can be a lot to keep up with, but I feel like, the more you pay attention, the easier it can be to kind of determine, okay, this is something that is really different that is being said that's worth my time and focus. And this is something, that he says every rally or whatever it may be. So it gets easier to sort of differentiate, but it can be overwhelming at times for sure.
So I have one final question before I let both of you go, and it's because I know you both have these inherent instincts as a reporter, which is to go gung-ho for a story and to interview people and to get right in the middle of things. The problem is there's COVID out there. So what are you doing to make sure that you're safe in these environments, particularly in this political environment where one candidate supporters don't believe in some of these precautions, and you still have to interview them. And Brett, you've been in the White House, which was like a hot spot. I mean, they were talking that there are more cases in the White House than all of Taiwan. So, I mean, it's got to be a little scary and apprehensive. And how do you protect yourselves when you're trying to out there and cover things for your readers or your viewers?
Yeah, when you put it that way, comparing it to Taiwan, maybe it was a poor decision to go there last week. But yeah, it's a very different and unique environment. And, I ended up traveling with the vice president about a month ago he did campaign stops in Wisconsin and Montana. And the event in Wisconsin was like in a hotel conference room, essentially. And, there was maybe 250 people and very few of them were wearing masks and their seats were maybe a couple feet apart. But it can be kind of nerve wracking at times to be in the room and be constantly thinking about like, okay, like, these people probably weren't tested and stuff. So it's definitely kind of in the back of my head, I would definitely say. But I mean, personally for me, I just, I wear a mask all the time. Sometimes like when I was at the White House last week, I wore 2 masks. And so you just kind of try to take all the precautions you can. And for me, I think it's just such an exciting and interesting time that I want to be a part of it. And sometimes I have to take a step back and think about, okay, is traveling to this event or going to this worth it to potentially risk my health for? But, it's definitely changed the way we cover things and the way we think about, okay, is this worth spending our time and energy on? But yeah, it's just such an interesting time. And I feel very grateful to be able to be a part of it and be out there doing this stuff. So I try to keep that in mind when I get the opportunity to go, even if it means taking some extra precautions and taking some extra risks along the way potentially.
Seema?
Same. I mean, I'm not in the White House, obviously, but I mean, I've been traveling increasingly since this all happened, and taking all the precautions, wearing masks, being really careful, wiping everything down, wiping down your hotel rooms. But the flying in the hotels have not. I mean, I've gotten more used to that. The thing that is still nerve-wracking at times is talking to voters because you don't know. And to speak to your point, like I was at a Pence rally like a week or two ago in Arizona. There was no social distancing. The vast majority of people were not wearing masks, and I wore my mask. But still, so I'm interviewing voters. I'm probably interviewing. I'm not interviewing as many voters as I would normally because you're trying to reduce the risk. Getting tested for COVID regularly, which is, it's not really comfortable, but it's good to know. And just worrying about balancing what you're trying to do with the risk involved. For example, when there was going to be more of an RNC in Florida, when the president was going to do a live speech outside, our editors decided, if he did that, we weren't going to send anybody there. They thought it was too dangerous. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post have made similar decisions about some recent Trump rallies about not having anybody inside because it's too dangerous. And I think I'm thankful that my editors are really conscientious about this. First of all, they said, if you don't want to travel, you don't have to travel. And I've been traveling. About half my colleagues are traveling, but half of them aren't, and then it's fine. It's totally accepted. And they are very encouraging of us to take precautions. Like if it takes you longer to get the number of voters because you couldn't go inside an event, and they're accepting of that, and I'm very grateful for that. So I think it's it's as Brett said. I mean, it's like balancing, because it's a great job, it's a fun job, it's an amazing story. Balancing your desire to do that story with trying to keep yourself safe.
Yeah. Well, we're going to end it on that, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate both of you coming with 2 weeks to go before the election. So consider this to be your respite before the last 14 days. And maybe we'll get together after it's all over and we'll do a little reflection back on that, all right?
Is it going to be over? Is that November or December?
Yeah, good question. To be determined, right? But do stay safe and keep doing what you're doing. You guys are both doing a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your time.
Bye.